Okay, onwards to further heroes. We will be next hearing from a real uniformed hero. Colonel Jeffrey Hutchinson is a colonel in the U.S. Army and former chief of adolescent medicine at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where he received the Medical Leadership Award. He is now the Chief Diversity Officer and Associate Dean for Clinical Affairs at the Uniformed Services University. It doesn't say this here, but I happen to know that he's in the Airborne Division, which means that this man can jump out of an airplane and save lives or not, depending on what's called for at the time. Dr. Hutchinson will be talking to us today about violence and media from his very specific perspective on it. Thank you.
Thanks, David. It is always a pleasure to be here to talk to you. I do have only one disclosure, that even though I am in uniform, these are my opinions. They do not represent the United States Army, and I have nothing else to disclose. The question I'm asked most often is, why does the Army need pediatricians? It's a good question. Yeah. When you think about the Army, you think about the use of force, you think about aggression, you think about taking over and occupying land. When you think about pediatricians, you think about caring for the health of children. When I explain that there are more kids eligible for service, or more eligible for care than there are people in the service, people understand that there is a definite need for pediatricians. And also, the largest group that we have in the military are our adolescents. They're 18 to 25-year-olds. So there's absolutely a need for pediatricians in the military. But being in the situation, having these two professions, has the potential of putting me in an unimaginable conflict. Obeying my Hippocratic oath to do no harm, or taking the life of someone in defense of a patient. I cannot talk about the influence of violence and media without talking about what's going on in the world with the shooting of black men and shooting of police. My father is retired LAPD, and I'm obviously a black man. So the idea of justice, of violence, of media, it's emotional, and it's something that I can't separate. But it's something that's worth talking about. It's something that reminds me of all of the people who I take care of. I've taken care of soldiers in many different situations. The vast majority were not shooters. The vast majority of people in the military work in support services. They, like I, take care of those who do the shooting. So the military is not filled with people whose primary purpose is to shoot other people. But everyone in the military, except chaplains and conscientious objectors, learn how to fire weapons. So my experience of actually seeing the effects of ammunition on children, civilians, combatants, it's not theoretical. I've also seen the effects of all of these munitions during training exercises. So this is something that is important to me and something I want to share with you today. Media in many different forms comes to us. As pediatricians, we want to decrease the amount of violence in this world, but media makes it very difficult. From movies like The Purge that glorify having a day where everyone is free to harm and hurt and kill people, to video games that are just disgusting, like Grand Theft Auto, that glorify sexual violence, to things that have no business being shown to children, such as some anime, some manga that shows bloody violence, and to other video games that depict graphic violence. These are all things that we are exposed to and make it difficult for us who in the health profession want to decrease violence whenever possible. And how does this relate to the military? There's the thought that military members glorify violence. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit, but the violence and the video games that go with military are something that we have to think about. And the three objectives I'd like to do today is I'd like to help you see the granularity of video games. I'd like you to be able to see that just like when we hear a game is educational, we have certain thoughts and we know that educational may not be educational. When you hear the word violent video game, I want you to be able to think that violence has its own granularity too. I want to compare the simulations and the video games and the fact that the video games that people play aren't equivalent to what we do in the military. And then lastly, I'll finish with some practical and helpful tips when you have patients and parents who want to change some of the behaviors. Aristotle said, what we repeatedly do, what we repeatedly do. Excellence, and I would also add, behavior then, is not an act, but a habit. Malcolm Gladwell made Anders Ericsson's 10,000 hours part of our lexicon. We can easily think about becoming an expert in something if we can just do 10,000 hours of that behavior. Well, he also pointed out that 10,000 hours in rush hour traffic does not make you a better driver. And I would also say that playing 10,000 hours of Halo or of Call of Duty does not make you a combat-ready individual. There are different types of violent video game, and let's accept the definition of a violent or aggressive video game when the player does harm to another player. The games can be as realistic as from the eye and the viewpoint of the person shooting to strategic, where you are looking on top of the field and you can tell forces which way to go and what to do. They can let you be ultra realistic and interact with everything in the environment, from the barrels, the crates, to every person in the game. Or like in the upper left corner, they can be very cartoonish, where characters will disintegrate into blocks and you have unlimited lives and you can continue to play. And there's also a new form of games that are considered aggressive, though not as violent, such as the game in the bottom right corner, Portal, where your goal is not to destroy the enemy, but to make it through puzzles. Games have evolved to the point where even those who are playing violently get bigger rewards if they do a non-fatal or non-fatal action. But let me show you 30 seconds of these 4 types of games.
Keep your head down! Okay, everybody find some cover! Spread out along the wall! Come to the stairs! Come out, we've got more grub! Take them out!
So can you imagine hours and hours of these? If, like most of us, the game in the bottom right probably caught your attention more so than the others. The upper right one may have caught your attention too. You'll notice the different perspectives. The cinematic effect, this gives you a good example that the graphics, the engagement of the game makes a big difference when it comes to getting players to play over and over again. But you have to be able to describe from perspectives. A first-person shooter is from the viewpoint of the shooter. The top 2 screens, one on the upper right is actually a live person who's using a GoPro cam to describe and to show what he's doing in a game. Second person perspective is not typically used in video games. It is very cinematic. Think of it as a cutaway scene or think of it as watching TV. It is when action is happening on the screen, but you have no control over it. And the bottom right is what we see more and more games that are considered third-person perspective, where you can see the entire character as you play the game. The controllers of games have evolved over the years. from the Atari joystick. Can I have a show of hands who ever had an Atari? Good, I'm not alone. From the Atari joystick to now the dual joystick with haptic control is another way to engage the player. So not only do they have visual and audio, but they also have tactile engagement to help them play more. Game manufacturers are constantly trying to increase the engagement, from virtual reality glasses to controllers that do look like weapons. 1987, Atari produced this pistol for about $200. And now, a Kickstarter campaign produced this $600 Delta 6 weapon. It is very difficult to argue that someone who practices, who plays with a $600 gamer control cannot translate that activity to a real AR-15. So that's my first point. We have to be aware of what the players use, of what controllers they have. I have much more concern for a player who has spent $600 and is playing this type of game for hours and hours compared to someone who just plays a game on their phone. Now, I know you're thinking, well, I don't want to know all the details about games. There's a million out there, and I just want to know the bottom line. What should I do when I have a patient who's in front of me and ask, should I worry about violent video games? Well, you're in luck. The American Psychiatric Association did a meta-analysis in 2015 that looked at what are the effects of violent video games. It has association with aggressive behavior, thoughts, and affect, and we know that there's a decreased association with empathy, pro-social behavior, and sensitivity to aggression. These are characteristics that can be beneficial. If you are in contact sports, it's important to be aggressive. If you're in combat, aggression is an asset. Or if you're debating, aggression may not be something that you want to give up. Now, how aggression is seen for men versus women is a whole nother lecture, but that is something that we do need to talk and think about. Schadenfreude is the desire, or is the appreciating someone else suffering. And as pediatricians, that is what bothers us. We don't want our patients having Schadenfreude. We want them to be productive, tax-paying individuals in the future. But it is something that we have to realize in the military does make a difference. So let me talk about how the military uses video games. There's the thought that the military is behind all of the Call of Duty and all the games that are out there. And I can tell you that the one time the Army did get involved with video games is America's Army. It was first released in 2002, about 9 years after Doom, the first-person shooter that really started the whole revolution. But it was released as a recruiting tool, used to help show people who potentially might think about the military what different jobs there are. Now, when less than 1% of the population serve in the military, 25% of our nation has ever put on a uniform, I have to say this is not a very effective way of getting everyone into the military to do it through video games. But it is one way that the military has used video games. But using video games to teach combat is like us telling medical students to play Hospital Tycoon before they learn how to be doctors. It's not specific enough. What we do in the military is very hands-on. People, to learn how to shoot, to learn how to take care of patients in the right environment, they have to have tactile engagement. Just like with the sim babies, just like with the simulation centers, people in the military need more hands-on experience in order to be proficient at their profession. The proficiency includes video game-like activities, but we have to use more realistic equipment. We have to use more realistic visual effects. But the visual effects aren't enough either. We also use laser equipment, we call Miles equipment. So the laser tag games that kids play, that did come from the military. Paintball. The military used paintball at first, but now we use simunition, which are actual bullets that deliver paint pellets that can be loaded into the weapons that we use. And there's nothing that substitutes for actual live fire, which is what we do in the military. So when you think about playing video games in the military and how it affects those who play, being aggressive is an attribute that we do appreciate in the military, but we don't encourage nor discourage those who play video games. We just realize that playing video games is one of the things that our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen do to pass the time. Now, we've had Stephen talk about weight, we've had Sujay talk about sleep, and we're going to have Megan talk about risk-taking behavior. In your handouts is another model to talk about how can we change people. The Prochaska di Clemente stages of change is what we use in adolescent medicine to help people change behavior. I'm going to go through what I do for patients who realize or who identify a need to change a behavior related to video games. The first step is pre-contemplation. I'm going to stop for a second. I want you to think, what would a patient or parent be like what might they say if they have no desire to change their behavior? A typical response might be, I play Halo, I play Call of Duty, it's no big deal. That's pre-contemplative. The important part of the Prochaska di Clemente stages of changes is to know that you cannot go from a patient who has no desire to change all the way to changing that behavior. So we have to help them change. We can lecture, we can try, but that doesn't typically change it. The statement that I like to use to help them think about it is ask them, what do you get out of playing video games? What could you be doing instead of playing video games? If you can identify something personal that affects their behavior, that affects them in a health matter related to their video games, either because of sleep or because of more aggressive behavior, or their friends call them a jerk because they're not as nice as they could be, that might be the first step that you need in order to get them to change from pre-contemplation to contemplation. Contemplation is the time when a patient might say, I've thought about how much I play. Maybe I could do something else. So this is another opportunity to ask them, if you weren't playing a video game, what would you do? Or the game that you play, does it affect you? They may answer. They may have a good reason to think about changing, and that's contemplation. We as providers will often fall down on the next phase, preparation. Great, they've identified that they can make a change. Now what? If you don't know much about video games, if you're not a big gamer, you may not be able to give them much advice. But this is where we can use the media model. We can use the home identification to figure out what we can do to help them change their behavior. One thing I did with my kids was actually made money that they could use to pay for games. So instead of allowance, or if they did extra chores, they could earn this money and they use that money to pay back. There's a great beauty in very loud alarms. Just like the arcades that we used to go to, once you put your quarter in and the time was up, the game ended. That kind of method for kids can work. But again, they have to be in the place where they're willing to change. They have to think, maybe I should play a little less video games. And then you can also talk about what type of video games. Maybe I shouldn't play this game, but I can play that game. But this is an opportunity when you prepare them to change, that they can talk about change. And then action. Once they come to see you, I love Dr. Phil's phrase, how's that working for you? When they come to see you and they've stopped playing video games, or they at least have cut back, or they've changed to less violent video games, ask them, how is it working for you? Again, you might think, I don't have time to talk about video games because I have so many other things to talk about. But that little bit of reinforcement can help them realize that you as the provider think it's important that they change that behavior, and you can be able to help them maintain that behavior. Maintenance is the time period that's been 6 months of change in behavior, and asking them again, now what are you doing now that you no longer play those games? And hopefully they'll give you good answers, such as, I'm reading more, I'm exercising more. Anytime that you can encourage them to do growth behaviors for their mind, their body, or their emotion, take advantage of that. And this is a good time to do that. But even if they do everything that you ask, if they've made those changes, behaviors can relapse. So it's okay if they come back and say, yeah, I tried. I thought that playing games was stupid, but all my friends got this new game, and I'm back to playing about 2 hours a day. Avoid that internal instinct to yell at them and say, but you came so far. Tell them, encourage them that you've done it before. You can do it again. So to summarize, some of the changes that you can think about in your practice. First, include in your media screening, actually ask them what game they're playing. Now, you may not know the difference between Call of Duty and Skyrim. Call of Duty sounds pretty violent. Skyrim sounds like a word that you've never heard. But at least note it in your documentation so that when they come back and they say, yeah, I used to play that game, but now I'm playing Grand Theft Auto, or now I'm playing Blockland. That can help you decide where, for your second point, where on the stages of change they might be. Do they want to change their behavior? Can you help them change their behavior? And then lastly, encourage all patients to intentionally replace video game or any behavior that is not as healthy with something that does encourage them, something that does increase their mental, physical, or emotional wellness. Thank you very much.
Wow.